Rain has emptied the village road. Under one weak lamp, a white shape stands where the asphalt meets the trees. It has no loose arms, no visible feet, and no reason to be there. The cloth gathers above the head and below the body. When lightning turns the road silver, the figure seems closer. This is the Pocong, one of the most recognizable ghosts in Indonesian popular culture. It is often described as a returning dead person still wrapped in a burial shroud. But the frightening silhouette is not merely a monster design. It borrows its power from real practices of caring for the dead. Tonight, we will separate funeral custom, oral legend, modern urban story, and cinema, because each layer changes what that white shape means. In everyday Indonesian usage, Pocong can refer to a body wrapped in its burial cloth, while haunted Pocong names the ghostly figure. English descriptions often call it a shroud ghost or wrapped ghost. The central material is kain kafan, plain cloth used to shroud the dead in Muslim funeral practice. Customs vary across communities, and religious rites should not be treated as horror props. The legend becomes frightening precisely because it starts with an image associated with dignity, equality, prayer, and final care. Popular horror reverses that meaning. Clean cloth becomes stained by rain and soil. A peaceful resting position becomes an upright silhouette. The body prepared for burial appears to have crossed back over the boundary that burial was meant to close. A responsible account begins with restraint. The white shroud belongs first to the care of an actual person who has died. Washing, wrapping, prayer, family presence, and burial are acts of responsibility, not supernatural theater. Indonesian communities do not follow one perfectly identical sequence, and local customs may accompany religious practice in different ways. Horror cinema isolates the cloth from that larger context because a single visual symbol works quickly on screen. The result is powerful, but it can hide the tenderness of the real ritual behind the monster. We can acknowledge the Pocong as a major cultural image without implying that Muslim burial creates ghosts. The supernatural conclusion belongs to folklore and fiction. The human practice belongs to mourning, dignity, and community. One widely repeated explanation says that the shroud's ties must be released when the body is placed in the grave. If they remain tied, the story says, the spirit may return because a final duty was left incomplete. Versions differ about who made the mistake, what the dead person wants, and how the problem can be repaired. This is a folkloric motif, not evidence that a burial produced a supernatural event, and it should not be presented as universal doctrine. As a story, however, it is emotionally precise. The ghost is not always returning to attack. It may be returning because the living failed to finish something. Fear grows from responsibility. The dead cannot rest until the community remembers what it owes them. The famous hopping motion seems inevitable once the body is imagined as tightly wrapped. Yet oral accounts and popular depictions do not agree on one method of movement. A Pocong may hop, drift, roll, appear suddenly, or remain terrifyingly still. Some storytellers insist that the screen version exaggerated the hopping. Cinema needs visible action and a readable rhythm, so a bound figure moving in short, violent jumps became an unforgettable convention. Stillness can be more disturbing in a spoken story. A figure at the far edge of a cemetery does not need to chase anyone. It only needs to be present each time the witness looks back. The rule changes because folklore is not a technical manual. Movement serves the fear a particular teller wants to create. Pocong stories often gather around cemeteries, village paths, banana trees, construction sites, empty schools, and roads used after dark. These are not random backdrops. They're places where familiar movement becomes uncertain. A path may be safe in daylight, but feel exposed at night. A cemetery may be close enough to daily life that people pass it routinely, allowing one unusual shadow to become the beginning of a story. Tropical rain, mist, insects, distant prayer, and weak lighting give the legend a sensory world. None of those details proves a supernatural encounter. They explain why a wrapped silhouette can become plausible for a few seconds, long enough for fear, memory, and retelling to transform an ambiguous sight into a named ghost. At its emotional core, the Pocong belongs to a much larger family of returning dead stories. Human beings worry about whether the deceased were cared for properly, whether promises were kept, and whether grief has reached an ending. The bound shroud makes unfinished business visible. A knot suggests closure, but in the legend it can also suggest restraint. The ghost therefore carries two opposite meanings. The body has been prepared for rest, yet something still prevents rest. Some stories make the figure threatening. Others make it pitiful, asking the living to correct a mistake. That tension is important. The Pocong is frightening not only because death has returned, but because the living may still be responsible for why it returned. Modern Pocong stories travel through conversation, school dares, neighborhood warnings, television, messaging apps, and short videos. A vague sighting gains a location, then a witness, then a reason the ghost appeared. Each retelling can make the account feel more concrete even when no reliable evidence emerges. This is how urban legends work. They remain just believable enough to be repeated and just exceptional enough to demand attention. The story can also regulate behavior. Children are warned away from cemeteries, people are urged not to walk alone, and disrespect toward the dead is given a supernatural consequence. That social function does not prove the ghost exists. It shows that a memorable figure can carry caution, grief, humor, and community anxiety at the same time. There is no single official Pocong biography shared by every Indonesian community. Some versions emphasize untied knots. Others focus on violent death, neglected burial, a broken promise, or a ghost with a local nickname and history. Malay language traditions also know the Hantabungkus, the wrapped ghost, showing how the image crosses modern national borders while keeping local meanings. Recent films introduce named variants such as the Pocong Gundul, adding new visual rules and backstories. Those inventions can become so popular that audiences remember them as older folklore. The responsible conclusion is not to force every version together. It is to identify which detail comes from oral tradition, which comes from a regional retelling, and which was created or amplified by modern entertainment. Indonesian film and television turned the Pocong into a national silhouette. Researchers have even proposed the term Pocongsploitation for a local cycle of films built around the shroud ghost. The creature is ideal for visual horror. It can be recognized instantly, produced with a simple costume, and placed in almost any setting. Screen language adds sound, sudden movement, makeup, camera angles, and the timing of a reveal. Academic work on Indonesian horror argues that antagonists change with social and political conditions, as well as global genre influence. The cinematic Pocong is therefore not a fossilized folk belief. It is a modern cultural product that repeatedly edits religious symbolism, local memory, commercial entertainment, and contemporary fear into a new body. The Pocong can frighten an audience in one scene and become a joke in the next. Comedy sketches, advertisements, costumes, memes, and parody films use the rigid wrapped body because the silhouette is immediately familiar. Humor does not necessarily destroy the legend. It can make the figure more portable, moving it from cemetery stories into everyday popular culture. The same audience may laugh at an awkward hopping ghost and still feel uneasy on a dark road later that night. This double life helps explain the Pocong's durability. It can represent sacred boundaries, unfinished death, neighborhood rumor, cinematic shock, and playful national iconography. Few monsters survive by remaining solemn all the time. The Pocong survives because it can change emotional register without losing its shape. Return to the white shape beneath the street lamp. We now know that its power comes from several layers: the real dignity of burial cloth, the folkloric fear of an unfinished duty, the uncertainty of darkness, the social life of Rumour, and decades of Indonesian screen horror. These layers should not be collapsed. Funeral practice is not proof of ghosts. A claimed encounter is not documented history. A film is not an untouched oral tradition. Yet together they explain why the Pocong remains unforgettable. The shroud conceals the body, but the legend makes that concealment speak. It asks whether the dead were respected, whether the living completed their obligations, and whether grief can ever be tied closed. If you saw the figure ahead, would you fear it more if it moved, or if it waited?